In the first week of November 1907, while depositors stood in overnight lines outside the trust companies of New York City holding camp stools and sandwiches because a place in line was worth more than a day's wages, the most powerful private citizen in the United States sat in his personal library on 36th Street and Madison Avenue and played solitaire. His name was John Pierpont Morgan. He was 70 years old, he had a cold, and the American banking system was dying roughly 2 miles south of his card table. Bank presidents came to the library and begged him to act. Cabinet officials wired him. The Secretary of the Treasury put $25 million of federal money at the disposal of the New York banks and essentially asked Morgan where it should go. And through the worst hours of it, here is exactly what this video will walk through. First, the 72 hours in October 1907 when a failed copper corner lit the fuse, including the stock that fell from roughly $60 a share to $10 in a matter of days. Second, the mechanism itself. Why doing nothing is the single strongest move in a panic, anchored to the afternoon when the interest rate on overnight money in New York touched 100%. Third, the ledger evidence, what United States Steel actually paid for the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, set against what witnesses before Congress later claimed its oil reserves were worth. Fourth, the two other Americans who ran the same play decades apart, one of them a woman that almost no textbook mentions, who lent money to the government of New York City itself on her own terms. And fifth, the 5-part anatomy of the play, drawn from the primary record, so the pattern becomes something you can see rather than something you have to be told. A word on method. This channel does not work from legend. Every number in this episode traces to congressional testimony, to the contemporary press of 1907 and after, or to the published record of the investigations that followed. Where historians disagree, or where a claim was an accusation rather than a finding, I will say so out loud. The fuse was lit by a man Morgan considered beneath his notice. Fritz Augustus Heinze was a copper magnate from Butte, Montana, who had fought the Rockefeller-aligned amalgamated copper interests for years and had come to New York with a fortune and an appetite. In October 1907, his brother Otto attempted to corner the stock of the United Copper Company, betting that short sellers could be squeezed into buying shares back at any price the Heinzes named. The corner failed on October 16th. United Copper, which had traded near $60 a share, collapsed to around $10 within days. On its own, one failed speculation in one mining stock should not have mattered. But Fritz Heinze was also a bank president, and his partners and associates sat on the boards of banks and trust companies across the city. Depositors could not tell which institutions were entangled with the Heinz crowd and which were not. And in 1893, most of them had learned what happens to the last person in line. So they stopped trying to tell the difference. They simply went and got their money. By Monday, October 21st, the run had reached the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust company in New York, an institution with roughly $60 million in deposits and a marble headquarters on Fifth Avenue built to look like it could never fall. Its president, Charles Barney, was a Morgan acquaintance, a man who had dined at the right tables for 30 years. On October 22nd, depositors pulled about $8 million out of the Knickerbocker in less than 3 hours, and shortly after noon, the trust company suspended payments. Barney had appealed for help. The banks that cleared the Knickerbocker's checks had already cut it loose. And Morgan, who by then had teams of young men going through the trust company's books through the night, declined to save it. He is reported to have said that he could not go on and support everything, and the Knickerbocker was allowed to die in public, in the middle of the business day, in front of the newspapers of the entire country. Understand what that death accomplished. It converted a rumor into a proof. After October 22nd, no depositor in New York could be argued out of panic, because the panic had been validated by the most spectacular bank failure of the era. And the reason this matters to you, watching more than a century later, is that the pattern of that week, the selective rescue, the audited books, the patience of the one man holding cash, is not a story about 1907. It is a template, and the rest of this video is about the template. The mechanism, in plain language, is this. In a financial panic, the scarcest commodity on earth is not gold, and it is not credit. It is time. Nearly every actor in a panic is a forced seller, someone who must raise cash today at whatever price today offers because a depositor is at the window or a loan has been called. The one actor who can wait even for a few hours stops being a participant in the market and becomes the market. Prices are no longer discovered. They are quoted to him, and he chooses. Now watch the mechanism operate on a specific afternoon. On October 24, 1907, the panic reached the floor of the New York Stock Exchange itself. Brokers borrow overnight money, called money, to carry their positions, and on that day, there was effectively no call money to be had. The posted rate touched 100% on an annualized basis, and even at that price, lenders would not lend. The president of the exchange walked across Broad Street to Morgan's office and told him that unless money appeared within minutes, dozens of brokerage houses would fail and the exchange would have to close early for the first time since its founding. Morgan did not race the clock. He summoned the presidents of the major national banks to his office and informed them of the number he required, and within about 15 minutes, he had commitments of roughly $25 million, which was then offered on the floor at 10%. Read those two rates side by side. The market, in its terror, was pricing overnight money at 100%. The man with the cash chose to price it at 10%. That choice looks generous, and the newspapers of the week treated it as heroism. But notice what the choice proves. The rate was whatever Morgan decided it would be, not the market's number. His number. That is what indifference purchases in a panic. It does not merely purchase assets at a discount. It purchases the power to set the terms on which everyone else survives. Morgan's audit teams, which included a young banker named Benjamin Strong, who would later run the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, gave him something even more valuable than cash, which was knowledge. While the public could not distinguish a solvent trust company from a doomed one, Morgan's people had been through the books. He knew which institutions were merely illiquid and which were actually broken, which meant he alone could choose where the line of failures would stop. He drew that line at the Trust Company of America, telling the assembled bankers, according to the accounts of participants, that this then was the place to stop the trouble. The Knickerbocker fell on the far side of the line. And here is where the open question from earlier closes. Charles Barney, the Knickerbocker's president, the man Morgan declined to see in the critical hours, resigned in disgrace, and on November 14, 1907, he shot himself at his home on Park Avenue. Some of his depositors, the press noted, had not yet recovered a dollar. The mechanism does not record such outcomes in the ledger, but you should know they are there. Now the ledger itself and the purchase the panic made possible. Through late October, one large problem remained unsolved. A major brokerage house, Moore & Schley, was carrying loans of well over $20 million, and much of the collateral behind those loans was stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, one of the great mineral properties of the American South, holding coal fields and iron ore across Alabama. If Moore & Schley failed and that stock was dumped onto a panicked market, the collapse could begin all over again. The solution, arranged in Morgan's library during the first days of November, was elegant and breathtaking. United States Steel, the trust Morgan had assembled in 1901, would take the Tennessee Company stock off the market by exchanging it for its own bonds, an outlay on the order of $35 million in paper. Not cash. What was the Tennessee Company actually worth? That question was fought over for years afterward. Witnesses and critics before congressional investigators, including testimony gathered by the Stanley Committee in 1911 and 1912, argued that the company's iron ore and coal reserves made it worth several $100 million, with the most aggressive claims running as high as $1 billion, figures United States Steel vigorously disputed. You do not need to accept the highest number. Take the lowest serious estimate and the transaction remains one of the great acquisitions in American industrial history, executed at panic prices, paid for in bonds, by the buyer who had spent 2 weeks demonstrating that he alone would decide what got saved. But the deal had a legal problem, which brings us back to the breakfast. Acquiring the largest independent steel producer in the South looked exactly like the kind of consolidation the Sherman Antitrust Act existed to stop, and Theodore Roosevelt had built his presidency on prosecuting such combinations. So on the night of November 3rd, two of Morgan's men, Elbert Gary of United States Steel and Henry Clay Frick, boarded a special overnight train to Washington. They were seated with the president at breakfast on the morning of November 4th before the stock exchange opened, and they explained that the purchase was necessary to stop the panic, taking care by their own later accounts not to dwell on the value of what was being purchased. Roosevelt, with the financial system burning, agreed not to object. The news reached New York minutes before the opening bell, and the market steadied. The rescue was complete, and so was the acquisition, blessed at the highest level of the American government. In time for trading. Morgan did not invent the play. 35 years earlier, a version of it ran in Cleveland, Ohio in roughly 6 weeks. In the winter of 1872, John D. Tour, Rockefeller's Standard Oil, holding secret railroad rebate arrangements through a scheme called the South Improvement Company, approached the independent oil refiners of Cleveland with a simple choice: sell to Standard at Standard's appraisal, or compete against a rival whose freight costs you can never match. The journalist Ida Tarbell, whose father lived through it, documented the result in her history of the company. 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries sold to Rockefeller in about 6 weeks, many at prices the sellers spent the rest of their lives calling ruinous. Rockefeller never had to raid anyone. He arranged the conditions, stated his terms, and waited for arithmetic to do the persuading. The same patience, in a different key, built the Carnegie Steel empire. When the Panic of 1873 broke and construction across the country stopped, Andrew Carnegie kept building his great Edgar Thomson steelworks outside Pittsburgh, precisely because the Depression had cut the cost of labor, land, and materials out from under his competitors. He would later write, in his own reflections on business, that the moment to expand was the moment when others could not, a sentiment his career repeated in every downturn he lived through. The mill opened in 1875 into a market his rivals had spent the Depression retreating from. And then there is the example, the textbook skip, which is why I flagged her at the start. Henrietta Green, known to the press of her era by the cruel nickname, the Witch of Wall Street, was very likely the richest woman in America, and she ran the waiting play as a personal religion. She kept enormous cash reserves when cash paid nothing. She refused leverage, and she lent only when the borrower had no alternative. In the crunch of 1907, among her borrowers was the government of New York City itself, which came to her for a loan reported by the newspapers of the day at over $1 million, secured by short-term city revenue bonds on terms she dictated. She had reportedly sensed the coming squeeze months earlier and called in her own loans in advance, so that when the panic arrived, she was one of the only lenders in New York still liquid. No library, no audit teams, no president at breakfast. Just a woman in a rented flat in Hoboken who understood, as clearly as Morgan did, that in a panic, the person who can wait collects a toll from everyone who cannot. So let us name the parts. Here is the anatomy of the play, in 5 pieces, each one documented in the record you have just heard. Part 1. Own the clock. The player never allows urgency to transfer to himself. On October 24th, the exchange had minutes. Morgan had all afternoon, and the 15 minutes he took to raise $25 million were 15 minutes in which every other man in New York finance was reminded who was waiting for whom. In every version of the play, watch for the actor who lets deadlines belong exclusively to other people. Part 2. No more than the room. Panic is an information failure. Depositors ran on solvent and insolvent institutions alike because they could not tell the difference. Morgan's night audits, conducted by men like Benjamin Strong, meant that one participant in the panic possessed the one commodity the panic had destroyed, which was accurate knowledge of who was actually broke. The play requires that asymmetry. The player sees the ledgers. The crowd sees the line outside the door. Part 3. Rescue selectively. This is the coldest part and the most important. The Knickerbocker was allowed to fail. The Trust Company of America was saved. Both decisions were made by the same private citizen in the same week, and the difference between them was not sentiment. It was judgment about where a failure served the larger position and where it threatened it. A selective rescue is not charity, it is curation. The player decides the shape of the surviving system, and the survivors know exactly whom they owe. Part 4. Buy the mispriced asset with someone else's paper. The Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company left the market for United States steel bonds, not for Morgan's cash. Rockefeller paid Cleveland refiners in Standard Oil stock or in appraisals his own scheme had depressed. The play at its purest spends instruments whose value the player himself controls to acquire assets whose value the panic has temporarily concealed. The ledger records a rescue. Time reveals a purchase. Part 5. Wash the play in legitimacy. The overnight train, the breakfast on November 4th, the presidential assurance delivered before the opening bell, and the week of newspaper coverage crowning Morgan the savior of the American financial system. Every successful run of the play ends with the player being thanked. That is not an accident of public relations. It is a structural requirement because the play must be repeatable, and it is only repeatable if the last performance is remembered as a rescue. When Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin stood in the Senate in March of 1908 and charged that a group of financiers had deliberately brought on the panic for their own advantage, his accusation, and it was an accusation, never a court finding, collided with a public that had already filed the story under gratitude. Whether the panic was engineered or merely harvested is a question historians still argue. What the record establishes beyond argument is narrower and, I would suggest, more useful. Whoever lit the fire, one group of men had the water, chose where to pour it, and owned considerably more of the city when the smoke cleared. There is one more layer, and it is the one even careful students of this period sometimes miss. In 1912, Congress convened the Peugeot Committee to investigate what the newspapers called the Money Trust. Its report, published in February 1913, found that the partners of J.P. Morgan and Company, together with the directors of two allied banks, held 341 directorships in 112 corporations with combined resources of over $22 billion, a sum that dwarfed the annual budget of the federal government. And it was before that committee, in December 1912, that Morgan himself, months before his death, delivered the sentence I promised you at the start. Asked by the committee's counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, whether commercial credit was based primarily upon money or property, Morgan answered, "No, sir, the first thing is character, before money or property or anything else." 11 words, and the whole mechanism is inside them. He was telling the committee accurately that the system ran on his judgment of who deserved to survive, which is precisely what the week of the panic had demonstrated. And the final twist is this. The panic of 1907 became the founding argument for the Federal Reserve. In November 1910, at a private retreat on Jekyll Island, Georgia, Senator Nelson Aldrich met with a small group of bankers, among them Henry Davison, a Morgan partner, and Paul Warburg, to draft the framework that became, after revision, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The stated purpose was to ensure the nation never again depended on one aging man in a library, whether the cure escaped the influence of the men who helped write the prescription is a question this channel will take up another day. If you take a single idea from this episode, take this one. The robber barons are remembered for aggression, for the raids and the corners and the crushed strikes, and that memory is not wrong. But it hides the quieter weapon. The largest single transfer of value in the panic of 1907 was accomplished by a man who, at the decisive moments, appeared to be doing nothing at all, and the 5 parts of his play, the clock, the knowledge, the selective rescue, the controlled paper, and the legitimacy wash, did not retire with him. Historians and financial writers have traced the family resemblance in crisis after crisis since, wherever forced sellers meet a patient buyer whose losses have somehow become everyone's emergency. But next time you watch a crash on the news, do not only watch the people running, look for the persons sitting still and ask what the stillness is going to cost everyone else. If this kind of history is worth your time, subscribe to the channel and tap the like button because it genuinely helps these stories reach the people who were never taught them. And I will see you in the next one.